Zara gazed at the fractured viewport of her aging spaceship, her fingers trembling as she clutched the control panel. The stars beyond were cold and distant, their pale light mirroring her own despair. Each flicker of light felt like a silent witness to her spiraling existence, a vast, uncaring cosmos offering no comfort or answers. Behind her, a soft, curious voice broke the silence. "Mom, are we almost there?" Lena's small hands tugged at Zara's sleeve, her wide, glowing eyes filled with both wonder and exhaustion. Zara turned toward her daughter, her expression softening despite the storm raging within her. Lena's innocence was a sharp contrast to the desolation Zara felt. "Almost, my love," she whispered, her voice steady but gentle. "Earth is just ahead." The journey had been grueling. Zara's home planet, Eldor, was a place of sleek, modern architecture, technological marvels, and rigid social rules. Every aspect of life was governed by inflexible traditions, and families were sacred, with their unity reflecting one's honor and status in society. To live outside of that system meant isolation, a life shunned and looked down upon. Once, Zara had been at the heart of that structure, cherished and admired as the wife of Kale, a man whose ambition stretched as far as the stars. He had been charismatic, daring, and visionary, a rising star within Eldor's elite ranks. Zara had loved him deeply, their bond unbreakable. They had spent hours discussing their dreams, their plans to explore distant worlds, and the legacy they would leave for their child. But dreams had a way of twisting into nightmares. Kale's ambition consumed him. What had begun as a quest for knowledge and adventure spiraled into greed. He began dealing with shady forces in dangerous trade routes that promised wealth and power. Zara pleaded with him to stop, to think of Lena, but he refused to listen. One day, without warning, he left. At first, Zara waited, believing he would return, that the man she loved would remember his promises and his family. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and the truth began to sink in slowly, like a cold fog creeping over her heart. Kale wasn't coming back. His absence wasn't just an emotional wound, it became a societal scar. On Eldor, single mothers were seen as failures, women who could not maintain their family's unity. They were whispered about in public spaces, their children mocked or ignored. Zara's once bright life dimmed under the weight of judgment and isolation. "Mommy." Lena's voice pulled Zara back to the present. The child's face was pale, her cheeks hollow from days of meager rations. Zara bit her lip, guilt and determination warring within her. She knelt, brushing a strand of golden hair from Lena's face. "You're so brave, my little star," she murmured, pressing a kiss to Lena's forehead. "Just a little longer." The ship groaned, a harsh reminder of its deteriorating state. Zara glanced at the navigation panel. Earth's atmosphere was close, its blue and green hues vivid against the vast void. A sliver of hope pierced her despair. According to the scarce information she had gathered, Earth was home to a compassionate species. Humans. Perhaps they would offer what Eldor had denied her, a chance to rebuild her life with Lena. The descent was chaotic. Alarms blared as the aging ship's systems struggled to handle atmospheric entry. Zara gritted her teeth, her hands flying over the controls trying to keep the craft steady. Lena clung to her arm, her small body shaking. "It's okay, Lena. I've got you," Zara said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. The ship shuddered violently. A deafening crack split through the cabin, and sparks flew as a panel burst open. Smoke filled the air, stinging Zara's eyes. She activated the emergency landing protocols, praying that the ship wouldn't break apart before they touched down. Finally, with a bone-jarring crash, the spacecraft skidded to a halt. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Zara sat frozen for a moment, her ears ringing, heart pounding. "Mommy!" Lena's small voice broke the stillness. Zara unbuckled herself, stumbling to her daughter. She examined Lena for injuries, her hands shaking. "Are you hurt?" Lena shook her head, her eyes wide but calm. "I'm okay." Relief washed over Zara, and she pulled Lena into a tight hug. "Good girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The surface of Earth was a stark contrast to Eldor's sleek, glowing cities. The landscape was raw and unpolished. Trees swayed in the stormy wind, their branches clawing at the dark sky. Rain poured in sheets, soaking Zara as she carried Lena from the wreckage. She scanned the area quickly, her eyes alert for any potential threats. The environment was unfamiliar, its sounds and scents alien to her. But there was no time to dwell on her unease. Lena needed shelter. Using debris from the ship, Zara constructed a crude lean-to beneath a large oak tree. The rain dripped through cracks in the makeshift shelter, but it offered some protection from the relentless downpour. Zara wrapped Lena in a blanket and sat close to shield her from the cold. As the storm raged around them, Zara's mind churned with worry. She had no resources, no allies, and no idea how the inhabitants of this planet would react to her presence. But as she gazed at Lena's peaceful face, her resolve hardened. She had not come this far to fail now. For hours, Zara kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. The storm began to subside, the rain softening to a steady patter. Exhaustion tugged at her, but she refused to sleep. She couldn't risk it. Just as dawn began to break, painting the sky with pale streaks of gold, Zara heard rustling in the nearby brush. Her heart leaped into her throat. She tightened her grip on a jagged piece of metal she had salvaged from the ship, ready to defend her daughter at all costs. A figure emerged from the mist, tall, broad-shouldered, with cautious movements that spoke of both curiosity and weariness. Zara's breath caught. This was no alien. It was a human. For the first time since leaving her home planet, Zara felt a flicker of both hope and fear. "I'll get some towels," Ethan said. But Zara remained still, watching closely as he disappeared into another room. Her instincts were heightened, alert to every detail. Lena, on the other hand, wandered toward the couch, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mommy, it's warm here," Lena whispered, her voice filled with awe. Zara's chest tightened. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a wet strand of hair from Lena's face. "Stay close to me," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "Always close." Ethan returned moments later with towels draped over his arm. He handed one to Zara and placed the other on the couch for Lena. "The fire's warm. You're welcome to dry off," he said, stepping back to give them space. Zara accepted the towel but didn't let her guard down. She dried Lena first, wrapping her daughter tightly in the dry cloth before tending to herself. Her movements were quick and efficient, driven by the instinct to protect and provide. As the evening wore on, Ethan busied himself in the kitchen, giving Zara and Lena time to adjust. He moved with quiet purpose, gathering ingredients and setting a pot on the stove. Zara watched him, her sharp eyes tracking his every move. "Soup will be ready in a bit," he said over his shoulder. "Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up." Zara didn't respond. Her mistrust lingered, but there was something different about this man. His deliberate movements, his calm demeanor, set him apart from the others she'd known. He didn't demand answers or offer expectations, simply providing. Lena, ever curious, broke the silence. "What's soup?" Ethan turned, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's food, warm food. You'll like it." Zara frowned. "She doesn't eat your food." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Fair enough. If she gets hungry, let me know. I'll see what I can do." As Lena dozed on the couch, wrapped snugly in blankets, Ethan brought Zara a steaming bowl of soup. She eyed it warily before accepting it, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bowl. "You don't have to tell me anything," Ethan said, sitting across from her. "Not where you're from, not why you're here. But I figure you've been through a lot. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome here." Zara stared at him, taken aback by his words. His eyes were steady, his tone sincere. She had heard offers of help before, but they always came with strings attached, expectations, demands, betrayals. This man's gaze held no agenda, only quiet compassion. For a moment, Za considered telling him the truth. The crash, her flight from Orth, her desperation to protect Lena. But fear held her back. Instead, she nodded curtly. "Thank you." He didn't press further. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and rose to stoke the fire. As the night deepened, Za found herself watching him, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded exterior. There was something in his movements, a heaviness, a silent burden that spoke of loss. She recognized it. She had lived it. Whatever Ethan had endured, it had left its mark on him. Deep lines etched into his soul, visible in the sadness in his eyes. For the first time since Kel's betrayal, Za felt a sliver of safety. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close. And for now, that was enough. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world silent and still. Inside, beneath the warm glow of the fire, two strangers sat quietly, unknowingly beginning a journey that would change their lives forever. In the morning, Za woke with a start. Her body tensed instinctively, her mind snapping to awareness. The room was unfamiliar, but the warmth from the fireplace was a sharp contrast to the harsh conditions she and Lena had endured in recent weeks. For a moment, she didn't recognize the soft sounds of earth, the chirping of birds, the creaking of wooden beams in the farmhouse, the distant lowing of cattle. Then, she saw Lena. Her daughter was still curled up on the couch, cocooned in the blanket Ethan had provided. Lena's breathing was soft and even, her face relaxed in a way Za hadn't seen in months. It was a sight that warmed and shattered Za's heart. Lena shouldn't have had to endure this life they had been thrust into, but here she was, adapting in a way only children could. The sound of clinking dishes drew Za's attention to the kitchen. She stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the jagged metal shard she'd kept close during the night. It was still there, tucked into the folds of her makeshift belt. Quietly, she rose, padding toward the sound. Ethan stood at the counter, his back to her. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up, exposing forearms marked with faded scars, remnants of a life shaped by labor and hardship. He moved with quiet efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl and stirring them with a fork. The soft hiss of a pan heating on the stove filled the silence. Za lingered in the doorway, her sharp gaze assessing every detail. The kitchen was small but well kept, its surfaces worn but clean. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, their earthy scent mixing with the aroma of coffee brewing on the counter. "You're up early," Ethan said without turning. His voice broke the silence, but his focus remained on the task in front of him. "Didn't think I'd hear you over the floorboards." Za straightened, stepping into the room with measured caution. "I couldn't sleep." Ethan glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression neutral. "I get that. There's coffee if you want some. Eggs will be ready soon." Za didn't respond. She crossed her arms, her gaze drifting to the window. The fields outside were blanketed in mist, the rising sun casting a soft glow over the horizon. It was eerily peaceful, so different from the chaos of her recent life. Ethan turned back to his work, undisturbed by her silence. He cooked with the same quiet competence as before, as though used to doing everything alone. The realization pricked at Za's curiosity, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. "Your daughter's still asleep," Ethan said after a moment. "Yes," Za replied curtly. She wasn't ready to share more. Ethan didn't press further. He plated the eggs and set them on the table, along with a loaf of fresh bread. "Help yourself," he said simply, pouring a cup of coffee and sitting down at the table. He didn't eat. Instead, he sipped his coffee and gazed out the window. Lena's soft footsteps broke the silence as she appeared in the doorway, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her wide eyes flicked between Za and Ethan, hesitant but curious. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice softer than before. "You hungry?" Lena hesitated, glancing at her mother for permission. Za gave a small nod, and Lena approached the table, her movements cautious but no longer fearful. Ethan cut a slice of bread and placed it on a plate, pushing it toward her. Lena took it with both hands, her small fingers gripping the edges as though it might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're welcome." Over the next few days, a tentative routine began to take shape. Ethan provided food and shelter without asking for anything in return. Za allowed herself to cautiously lower her defenses, though only slightly. She spent her days helping Lena adjust to their new environment, teaching her the names of Earth's creatures, and marveling at the simple beauty of things they had never encountered before. The vibrant green of grass, the warmth of sunlight unfiltered by the harsh metallic skyline of Orth, the way rain felt soft and cool rather than biting and cold. Ethan stayed busy with his work, tending to the fields and repairing the damage from the storm. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, giving Za and Lena the space they needed. Yet his quiet presence was a constant, and Za found herself observing him more than she cared to admit. There was a weight to him, a heaviness in his movements, a quiet sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. It wasn't pity, though. It was understanding, the kind that only came from surviving something that left you broken and rebuilding yourself piece by piece. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Za found herself sitting on the porch steps. Lena was inside, fast asleep after a day spent chasing butterflies in the field. The air was cool, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. Ethan joined her, sitting a respectful distance away, holding a mug of coffee in his hands. The steam curled into the fading light. "You've been quiet," he said after a long pause. Za glanced at him, her expression guarded. "I don't have much to say." The Za looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of her past pressed heavily on her chest, a burden she had carried alone for so long. But something about Ethan's calm, unassuming presence made her feel, for the first time in ages, like maybe she didn't have to carry it all by herself anymore. His silence wasn't empty, it was steady, and it filled the space between them in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Maybe, she thought, it wouldn't be so bad to let someone in, just a little. But the fear still lingered, wrapped tightly around her heart. "That's fair," he replied. "But sometimes saying it out loud helps." Za looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of her past pressed heavily on her chest, a burden she had carried alone for so long. But something about Ethan's calm, unassuming presence made her feel, for the first time in ages, like maybe she didn't have to carry it all by herself anymore. His silence wasn't empty. It was steady, and it filled the space between them in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Maybe, she thought, it wouldn't be so bad to let someone in, just a little. But the fear still lingered, wrapped tightly around her heart. As he listened, Za continued, her tone softening. "I had to leave. Not for me, but for Lena. She deserves better than what our world offered." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Sounds like you've done everything you can to protect her." Za looked at him, surprised by the lack of judgment in his voice. "I have," she said, her voice firm. "And I'll keep doing it no matter what." Ethan's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I believe you." The silence that followed was different now, less heavy, more understanding. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Za felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Inside the farmhouse, Lena stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Za rose to check on her, pausing at the door to glance back at Ethan. He was still sitting on the steps, staring out at the darkening fields, his shoulders relaxed, his expression peaceful. For the first time, Za wondered if this place, the quiet farm on a strange, distant world, could truly be a home. Days stretched into weeks, and a fragile sense of routine began to settle over the farmhouse. Za found herself slowly easing into this new life, though a part of her remained on edge. It was too simple, too peaceful. Life had taught her that such serenity was often fleeting. For Lena, though, the farm was a wonderland. Each day brought new discoveries: the fluttering butterflies, the soft bristles of grass beneath her feet, the curious antics of the chickens that Ethan kept in a small coop. Za watched her daughter thrive in this new world, her laughter ringing out as she dashed across the fields. It was a sound Za hadn't heard in what felt like years, and it filled her heart with both joy and dread. But Za couldn't shake the shadow of her past. The scars left by her husband's betrayal and society's judgment clung to her like a second skin. Even here, in the safety of Ethan's home, she couldn't banish the fear that it could all be ripped away. Ethan, as always, was a quiet presence. He rose before dawn, tending to the farm with practiced efficiency. Za often joined him, helping in small ways, mending fences, collecting eggs, or simply keeping Lena occupied while he worked. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful. The silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. Yet even as their bond deepened, Za remained wary. She caught herself analyzing Ethan's every action, searching for ulterior motives that never seemed to exist. He was kind without being overbearing, generous without expecting anything in return. It baffled her. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the vegetable garden, Za finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Za frowned. The answer was too straightforward for her liking. People don't just do things out of kindness, not without wanting something in return. Ethan leaned against his shovel, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's been your experience," he said after a moment. "But not everyone's like that." The words struck a chord, but Za didn't respond. She turned back to her work, her thoughts churning. That night, as the farmhouse settled into quiet, Za sat by the fire, her mind restless. Lena had fallen asleep hours ago, her small body curled up in a nest of blankets. Ethan was in his room, the creak of floorboards signaling his movements as he prepared for bed. Za stared into the flames, their flickering light casting shadows on the walls. She couldn't stay here forever, she told herself. This was temporary. A refuge, not a home. But the thought of leaving filled her with a cold dread. Where would they go? How would she keep Lena safe? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the floorboards behind her. She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression cautious but kind. "Can't sleep?" he asked, stepping into the room. Za shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Ethan sat down in the chair across from her, cradling a mug of tea in his hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of wind outside. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Ethan said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "You and Lena can stay as long as you need." Za's chest tightened. "And what happens when you change your mind?" she asked, her voice sharp. "When you decide we're too much trouble?" Ethan's brow furrowed, his gaze steady. "I won't." "How can you be so sure?" she demanded, her voice rising. "People always leave. Always." But Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe most people do. But I'm not most people." Za stared at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his eyes, an honesty that unnerved her. It wasn't pity or obligation. It was something deeper, something she wasn't sure she could trust. "I can't lose her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's all I have." "You won't," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Not while you're here." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time in years, Za felt the faint stirrings of trust. It was fragile, like a fledgling taking its first steps. But it was there. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Ethan taught Za the rhythms of the farm, how to tend to the animals, when to plant and harvest the crops, the intricacies of maintaining the machinery that kept everything running. Za found herself enjoying the work. The physical effort grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. Lena, too, thrived in this environment. She followed Ethan around like a shadow, her endless questions bringing a rare smile to his face. Za watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and fear. She wanted to believe this could last, but the fear of losing it was ever present. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Za finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I can't keep depending on you," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not fair." Ethan glanced at her, his expression calm. "You're not a burden, if that's what you're thinking." "But I am," she said, her voice firm. "And I can't live like this, wondering when it's all going to fall apart," Za said, her voice tinged with a quiet desperation. Ethan was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "What do you want, Zaya?" he asked, his question unexpected, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to him, brows furrowed. "I want Lena to be safe. I want her to have a future." Her voice softened, but then Ethan pressed further. "And what about you? What do you want for yourself?" Za hesitated. The question struck a nerve. She had spent so long focusing solely on Lena's needs that she hadn't allowed herself to think about her own desires. What did she want? Safety? Stability? Yes, but more than that. She realized she wanted a place to belong. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his expression understanding. "Well, maybe that's something we can figure out together." The simplicity of his words held a weight that made Za's chest ache. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the idea that this life, this man, could be the beginning of something more. But taking that step would require courage. Courage she wasn't sure she had. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the horizon. Za stood on the farmhouse porch, watching as the sun broke through the clouds, its golden light spilling across the landscape. In the distance, Lena's laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Ethan was nearby, repairing the fence that bordered the field, his steady movements a reassuring constant. For a moment, Za allowed herself to breathe deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Peace. It felt fragile, like a glass too thin to hold its shape. But it was there. She wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of the decision she had made the night before still heavy on her mind. The evening prior had been a turning point. After weeks of wrestling with her fears, Za had finally allowed herself to confront them. She had waited until Lena was asleep, her small body tucked under a quilt Ethan had given her. Then, with a resolve born from desperation and hope, Za had approached Ethan. He had been sitting by the fire, a book resting in his lap, the room quiet save for the soft crackle of the flames. "I need to talk to you," Za had said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Ethan had looked up, his expression open and calm. "All right." She had stepped into the room, her movements deliberate, and sat down across from him. For a moment she couldn't find the words. They tangled in her throat, threatening to choke her. But she forced herself to speak. "I don't want to leave," she had started, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stay like this, uncertain, waiting for the day it all falls apart." Ethan had set his book aside, leaning forward slightly. "What are you saying?" Za had taken a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his. "I'm saying I want more than shelter. I want stability, a home, a family." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with vulnerability. Za had braced herself for rejection, for disbelief. But what she had seen in Ethan's eyes had startled her. It wasn't pity or hesitation. It was understanding. "You're serious?" he had asked, his tone quiet but firm. "Yes," she had replied, her voice unwavering. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I can't keep living in fear. And Lena, she deserves more than a mother who's always looking over her shoulder." Ethan had been silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, he had nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right." Za had blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "All right?" "I've been thinking about this for a while," he had admitted, his voice steady. "About you. About Lena. You've brought something back into this house I thought I'd lost forever. I wasn't sure if I could handle it, letting someone in again. But I want to try." His words had broken something in Za, the walls she had spent years building cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She had looked away, blinking back tears, and nodded. "Okay." Now, as she stood on the porch, watching Lena play in the morning light, Za felt the first stirrings of hope. It wasn't a dramatic shift, her fears hadn't disappeared overnight. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. The transition wasn't seamless. Building a life together required patience and compromise. Za and Ethan learned to navigate their differences, their sharp edges softened by the quiet steadiness between them. They found common ground in their shared determination to give Lena a stable, happy life. Lena, for her part, flourished in this new dynamic. She adored Ethan, following him around the farm, peppering him with endless questions. He answered each one with patience, his gruff exterior softening in her presence. Za watched their bond grow with a mixture of gratitude and awe, her heart aching with the knowledge that Ethan had become the father Lena had never known. The challenges they faced were not insignificant. There were practical matters to address, introducing Za and Lena to the few neighbors who occasionally stopped by, explaining their presence without revealing too much. Ethan handled it with characteristic calm, weaving a story about distant relatives in need of help. It wasn't entirely a lie. He told Za later, in his eyes, they had become family. There were also moments of tension, particularly when Za's past threatened to intrude on their new life. She had nightmares, vivid, haunting dreams of Killer's betrayal, and the judgmental stares of her people. Ethan learned to recognize the signs, sitting with her in silence until the worst of it passed. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the stars spread like a tapestry above them. Za turned to Ethan. "Do you think they'll ever come for us?" she asked quietly. "Your people?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. She nodded. "If they find out where we are, I don't know what they'll do." Ethan's expression hardened, his gaze steady. "If they come, we'll deal with it together." The simplicity of his answer calmed her in a way she couldn't explain. She nodded, her fingers brushing against his as they rested on the wooden armrest. The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth through her that lingered long after. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The farm flourished under their combined efforts, and the house, once quiet and lonely, became a place of laughter and life. Ethan taught Za how to ride the old tractor, her initial frustration giving way to laughter as she navigated the uneven terrain. Za, in turn, shared stories of Orth with Lena and Ethan, her voice weaving a tapestry of a world both beautiful and flawed. The three of them found a rhythm, their lives intertwining in ways none of them had expected. They were still learning, still growing. But for the first time, they felt like a family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Za stood in the field, watching Lena and Ethan chase each other through the tall grass. Lena's laughter echoed across the farm, and Ethan's rare smile lit up his face. Za felt her chest tighten, the weight of her fears and doubts momentarily lifting. She had spent so long running, so long protecting herself and Lena from a world that had turned its back on them. But here, in this quiet corner of a distant planet, she had found something she hadn't dared to hope for. A place to belong. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Za joined them in the field, her heart full and her steps light. Together, they faced the unknown, not alone, but as a family, bound by love, resilience, and the promise of a future worth fighting for.